Just about wherever you look in psychology, personality, cognitive abilities, adjustment in children, everything seems to show genetic influence.
People who experience the same thing react differently as a function of their temperament, which is largely genetically controlled. But also people have different environments.
Whether or not the genes get turned on and off may depend on some experience that you've had.
And of course, behavior is the expression of a gene in an environment. And if you modify environments, you will modify genetic expression.
The environment is the nurture portion of the human equation. Those factors that further shape the emerging individual. The question is, if genetic differences account for about half of the variations in personality, what parts of the environment account for the rest?
From Freud onwards, we've always assumed that the family is the unit by which environments are doled out. So you think of parenting, are you an authoritarian parent or a permissive parent or an authoritative parent? It's thought that's the way the parent is, and so the child gets a particular environment. Well, what if there's another child in the family? You kind of assume, well, yeah, that kid gets the same parents, so it's the same environment. And so that ought to make them similar environmentally. The genetic data are actually pointing to the idea that children in the same family are different environmentally. A direct test is an adoption study where you get two children growing up in a family who are not genetically related. How similar are they? Not at all. Not for personality, not for psychopathology, not for learning disabilities, not even for weight, surprisingly. What that means is growing up in the same family doesn't make children similar.
That's true even when brothers and sisters have the same parents.
I'm a fraternal twin with a sister who looks nothing like me and is nothing like me. We had different friends, different interests, different abilities, and it was very easy for my parents to treat us differently because we simply encouraged different behaviors from them. In terms of intelligence, we're pretty much matched. In terms of personality, we're not. In terms of family values, we are. In terms of our tastes and friends, we're not.
But what makes them similar is nature rather than nurture. The issue is what makes them so different. And first thing is you realize the importance of studying what we ended up calling non-shared environment.
The experiences that people in a family have that are apart from things the other people have. They're the only ones to experience it, and it tends to make them different from everybody else. Now, we know that for most measured traits, it's the non-shared environment that really seems to have the greatest impact.
If the shared family environment accounts for fewer of our differences than expected, what aspects of the environment, the context, do matter? We'll take a look at three specific influences: the child's prenatal environment, their peer group, and their culture.
We have to start out with the prenatal environment because many things can happen there during those first 9 months to affect our development. What our mother eats, the kinds of medications that she takes, is she exposed to radiation, all of those kinds of things, even the positioning of the fetus in the uterus can affect certain kinds of developmental outcomes.
The significance of the prenatal environment was underscored in a study of 10,000 families in England that began in the early 90s.
A chance meeting with a colleague in France led to us talking about a study that I was involved in because we're interested in patterns of divorce and remarriage in this big cohort study of 10,000 families. What was interesting about this cohort is that the studies began with moms who were pregnant. And they had measured stress and anxiety and depression, lots of things in pregnancy, and had done so repeatedly. And so we began to look at this notion of prenatal stress and found that stress, and especially late pregnancy, predicted behavioral, emotional problems in kids at age 4. Even when we controlled for things like socioeconomic stress, postnatal stress and anxiety, obstetric factors, alcohol and smoking in pregnancy, all the kinds of things we could think we needed to control for. We then looked at the kids when they're about 7.5, and lo and behold, we still found an effect. As it turns out, there are now about 6 groups that have replicated this finding. The idea that experiences that happen at one point are carried forward in development, and they may not be modifiable by later experience.
As children mature, peers begin to exert a greater measure of influence.
And it makes sense, because children grow up with and ultimately will mate with and have their vocational lives with their peers. That's the audience they need to play to, not their parents. The child hears a Bostonian accent at home and a Georgian accent out on the playing fields in the school. Who's that child going to talk like? The answer, essentially 100% of the time, is like their peers, not their parents.
Although peers are very influential over what kids want to wear or how they spend their free time, what music they listen to, they're not very influential over their basic values, over their religious beliefs, over their sense of right and wrong. Their parents still are the main influences.
When you look at national surveys of the kids, you find out there isn't that much of a generation gap, that most of them kind of admire and like their parents.
I said turn that down!
Where we have blow-ups is on curfews and on can you control my television show and you don't like my friends. But we don't get these major blow-ups on a lot of the really fundamental issues.
So if you were to map out susceptibility to peer pressure over time, what you'd see is that it increases from childhood through early adolescence. It peaks at around 14 or so, and then it starts to decline again. So an 8th grader or a 9th grader is going to be much more susceptible to peer pressure than a 12th grader or a 4th grader would be.
Another influential variable in the environmental mix is the culture in which a child matures.
And what is culture? It's the fundamental experience of living by the rules and guides and beliefs and sensibilities and preferences and tendencies that organize a people.
I think culture is very powerful, not because of those very explicit rules, but because of many assumptions which make up the society. For example, think about baseball. There are many rules. If you hit the ball, you have to run toward the first base. You cannot really say, oh, I don't like it, I go to the third. And there are many such rules which define, say, your social relationship, or your social self, or your personal self, or say the notion of agreement or disagreement or social contract. And if you define culture in this way, which I think is right, as opposed to the definition of culture as a whole set of normative explicit rules, then I think it becomes very clear that culture is really central in understanding human behaviors.
At a very basic level, culture affects how parents interact with their children.
And some of the very interesting developmental studies now looking at differences between what toddlers and their moms do in American context versus toddlers and their moms in Japanese context. If I'm sitting down with a 18-month-old or a 2-year-old and I put a toy down in between us, what you'll see is that the mom typically will start giving a little lecture about this object and will start asking the child questions. Oh, look, it's a yellow bus. We came on a bus to get here today. What are these things?
This script is very prevalent, but Japanese mothers often do either social games, like social routines, like which would you like? Oh, this one. Oh, please. What would you like to say? Oh, thank you.
Using this, once again, same thing, same stimulus, in an exercise that produces a back and forth, a relational activity between the mother and the child.
Cultural patterns echo from one generation to the next. Psychologist James Jones uses the acronym TRIOS to describe the characteristics that link Black Americans to their African roots.
Historically, Africans have reckoned their time around the present and the past with relatively less emphasis on the future. Their society differs greatly from what a colleague of mine calls a tympanomic society, a society in which time is valued, time is money, time is an asset. You think of rhythm in terms of the rhythms of dance and movement and song, and I think that's a very important part of African culture. People sing as part of living. They sing their lives. They sing their stories. Improvisation concerns the ability to make strategic, adaptive responses to changing, unpredictable environments and contexts. And obviously, if you're in a situation where you lack freedom and control, then you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what's going to be waiting around the corner. And you have to be creative. You have to be flexible to get what you need to survive.
I have plowed.
Orality is kind of the oral tradition, which has always been associated with Africa. You tell stories, you don't write them down. They pass down from generation. So children learn how to be members of the culture through the oral tradition. And finally, spirituality, which is really the most central piece of all of this. Because if there's one thing that defines Africans, it's spirituality. And spirituality is not religiosity, it's not going to church. It's the fundamental belief that there is an intersection, a connection between the living and the dead, between animate and inanimate objects, that we all have some piece of the spirit in us that gives us the power to act.
As psychologists, we tend to focus on attitudes, aspirations, motivations, but we need to always understand that these are created in the context of a culture.
This cultural context often dictates relationships, both within and without the family.
When a person is traditionally Latino or Latina, they are not going to be trained in ways that are confrontational as a first level of interaction. Let me give you a specific example. If I want you to pick up something when your next trip downtown, I may not say, would you pick that up? Because if you say no, then we're both in an awkward position, you for denying me and me for asking. But if I say, are you going to go downtown? And you are a properly trained Latino, you will say, do you need something from downtown? If you have the space that allows for it. Or you can say, I'm running really tight of time. So you're already anticipating the need of the person. Some people have suggested that non-directive way of interaction indicates uncertainty of what people want, but in reality, what the person is doing is structuring the interaction in such a way that neither one of them loses face in the context of asking for a request. And I really think that when we think about culture, we need to be thinking of how people understand the meaning of what they're doing. And that is very difficult to assess.
The interface between people of different cultures may become even more complex if the group includes members of both individualist and collectivist societies.
In American culture, particularly middle-class, white, mainstream American culture, there's a very strong belief in independence of the self. Your person is defined primarily in terms of some attributes which are internal to you as a person, such as goals, desires, or personality trait, so you know what kind of person you are.
Mothers will say to kids, just be yourself when kids are worried about something or don't know how to behave. To an American, this means look inside yourself, think about what you really think or feel or believe, and try to express that in behavior. That's the proper way.
This assumption is not very common in many other cultures, particularly in East Asian cultures. The person is considered in those cultures as much more interdependent, and that who you are really depends on social context.
So try to be aware of what the important people in your world expect from you, what obligations you have from them, what's required. And so just think from their perspective and then behave.
Cultural traditions often prescribe gender roles and relationships between women and men.
Some cultures, the women can't even go out by themselves or have to totally cover their bodies and can't drive cars, etc. Well, then we have a very sharp tendency for men to be dominant and women to be subordinated. And then in other cultures, we have a system of relative equality. The U.S. is not at the top of the equality hierarchy by any means. It tends to be Scandinavian countries that have more equality.
Other than a single chromosome, how much difference actually exists between the sexes?
Men are bigger and stronger, particularly in upper body strength, and women have reproductive activity that men don't, obviously. And so women have tasks then, which tend to put them, therefore, in different roles because of those biological characteristics, not that automatically set a psychology, but they set life tasks that would differ between societies depending on the kind of environment the society is.
Actually, the psychological gender differences between men and women are quite small, despite what you see in the popular media, like John Gray's Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. It's not at all based on the scientific evidence. Somebody once said it's more like men are from South Dakota and women are from North Dakota, rather than being from two separate planets. So if we look at some of the stereotyped big differences, like math performance, men are supposed to be better at math. In fact, when you look across studies, the gender difference is tiny, and women actually excel in some areas. If you look at something like self-esteem, which has had a lot of publicity, girls, adolescent girls having self-esteem problems, in fact, those differences are small too. But we had to find that out. We had to do the research. We didn't know whether women would be markedly different from men or not.
I have never in my research found a difference between males and females in the expression of emotion or the recognition of emotion, or in my work with Levinson in their physiology of emotion. Many people are disappointed that I haven't found this, but we've looked, and we've looked decade after decade. But I haven't examined the triggers of emotion. I haven't examined the attempts to socially manage emotion. I've examined the elemental emotions occurring primarily in a non-social situation. In the deception work, which is interactive, I found no differences between males and females.
So any consideration of gender differences has to be balanced with a consideration of gender similarities. The other thing that we have to recognize is that patterns of gender roles and gender differences vary by ethnicity within the United States, and they vary across different cultures in the world. So that particular stereotypes that we find with white Americans, we find different stereotypes with black Americans.
Does that mean that the racial divide is greater than the gender divide?
African Americans live in a different world from white Americans, a totally different world. So if you're trying to compare whites and blacks on the same kinds of measures, they're not facing the same challenges, they're not facing the same circumstances, they don't bring the same temperament to it, they don't have the same history. And so there's a whole lot of reason to think that they'd be very different. And to argue then that treating people the same, treating people as if their race doesn't matter, is patently unreasonable.
Lots of people think that the goal of racial development is to become colorblind. But if you think about it, when we do not see something that is there, we're crazy. If we were talking about sex, and I said to a man, I do not notice what sex you are. If I was at all important to him, he would find that insulting, and he might do whatever he could to make sure I noticed what sex he was. And it's the same with race. We all know that we notice one another's racial categories because our society is built around that. So the goal is not to not notice race. The goal is to notice race and for it not to matter.
As humans, we share a common heritage and face common problems. Yet the differences that help define who we are, our culture, our gender, our race, often separate us in ways that are both cognitive and social.
I have done nothing wrong.
we talk about humans being cognitive misers. We can't process cognitively all the information that is presented to us, so we chunk it, we organize it, we distill it, we simplify it. And the social information that we get, we simplify into basic human groups. Gender is a primary categorical group, race is another one.
Stereotypes, by definition, are assuming things about people that you didn't really see in that individual. So if we see someone with a certain skin color, or if they're older or younger, or if they have an accent, or they're from a certain country, if they wear certain kinds of clothes, we make assumptions about them, even though there's nothing that they did necessarily that show that that's true of them.
You wouldn't be a member of the culture if you didn't absorb some of these associations. And they're so repeatedly conveyed in the media that people absorb these stereotypes and the emotional prejudices that go along with them just by being part of the culture. It's not that your parents were bad people and taught you or didn't teach you. It's not even that any individual person's a bad person. But these things are absorbed by all of us.
It's sort of an outgrowth of the general tendency that we have to simplify, to use shortcuts, to understand and make predictions about what people are going to be like.
We need to know what the other person's intentions are. Are they for good or ill? And in different societies, that gets categorized differently. It gets constructed differently depending on who you think of as your in-group and your out-groups.
There's interesting research in social psychology where people are assigned to be blue versus pink team, or they wear a placard of a different color. And that arbitrary and often random distinction leads to this separation of the two groups. The blue team view themselves as more cohesive, as brighter, as better than this group that was randomly constituted that's now the pink team. And that puzzles in some ways because it defies logic as to why that kind of emergence would happen. And again, you can tell an evolutionary story about the importance of forming alliances and being able to trust and cooperate and yet compete effectively for limited resources. And that may account for it, but it has profound social implications when we see discrimination and prejudice based on arbitrary distinctions coming about.
In some cases, discrimination and prejudice have distinctly social roots. The haves, people with money, power, and prestige, may develop attitudes toward the have-nots that justify the inequalities that exist.
In the random sample surveys, we're able to do precise description. What do people think of different groups in society? And we can discover things such as rich people all over the world are envied and resented. They're seen as highly competent but not very nice. And poor people all over the world are seen as neither nice nor competent. And old people all over the world are seen as, well, kind of nice and warm, but not too swift. And so, we can come up with these precise descriptions from surveys, but we can't infer causality. Well, our hypothesis is that the status of the group, that is, do they have prestigious jobs, are they economically successful, predicts in people's minds whether they're smart or not. So people justify the system.
Time to step through the door. You know which one to choose, don't you?
Most people would like to believe that they're not prejudiced, that they don't hold unjustified negative attitudes toward outgroups and their members. Can we harbor such feelings and not realize it?
When people say, I'm not prejudiced, I first say to them, you're right. You're not consciously prejudiced. And that's a very good thing. But I do say that I'd like them to entertain the possibility that that may not be the end of the story. The way I do it is twofold. First, I tell them about myself. I tell them that I've been a teacher of research in psychology, have taught seminars on the nature of prejudice for 20 years. And I show them my own bias. I show them my race bias, and I show them my gender bias. Neither is a bias that I knew about. Neither is one I'm proud of, but both are true of me. The second thing I do is to show them simple errors that they might make in ordinary ways in which they see things. These are simply ways of showing them that our minds, as intelligent and as remarkable as they are, come with bugs. So I begin with something that would be a no-brainer, as
cognitive neuroscientist might say. What I would do is ask residents of Boston, let's say, to rapidly associate words that capture the Red Sox and good things, while they're also associating the Yankees with bad. And this task is one that people can do incredibly fast. Now, I want you to very rapidly associate Red Sox with terrible things, bad things, and the Yankees with good things. And they'll groan and say, and because they know that this is going to be harder. And sure enough, people just start to laugh halfway through this test because they can't do it. They can't do it with nearly the same speed as they did the previous one, and they certainly are making a lot more errors. That's at the heart of the technique that we call the implicit association test. And then the moment arrives for the hard stuff. I remove the words that represent the Red Sox and the Yankees and replace them with black and white faces. And I say, let's just do the same thing again. Try to make an association first of white with good and black with bad, very fast. Switch it around. Now just do black with good and white with bad. I can do that. That's not like the Yankees and good. Black is just as good as white. I should be able to do that. And they can't. And that moment is a moment when a lot can happen.
Awareness may be half the battle. Just because people have prejudices doesn't mean that they have to engage in discrimination.
What people can control is what they do with that and how they think about other people. So even though you may have these stereotypes that pop into your head, or this little alarm bell that goes off, you can silence it from the get-go if you're thinking about what to serve the person for dinner. You know, would this person like broccoli or celery? And the effect completely goes away. So even something that's in the brain and that shows up in brain scans is not hardwired. So it's what I sometimes tell my classes is this stuff is more automatic than you think, but it's less automatic than we psychologists thought it was. It is malleable by context.
Researchers have also found that creating situations that encourage cooperation and communication among groups can mitigate the distrust and antagonism associated with prejudice.
My good friend and colleague Tom Pettigrew has done an excellent job of showing, yes, contact does have beneficial effects. It does improve intergroup relations, race relations. But I think that the basic point is that people have to want to change. They have to want to make a better society. They have to talk to each other, and they have to care about each other. And I think probably what runs through all of those programs is that the people come together, care about each other enough that they can have human contact and human dialogue, and ultimately, I think, in the Allport world, become friends.
Inside Out is a 22-part series about psychology. For information on this program and accompanying materials, call 1-800-576-2988 or visit us online.